He found the first note on a Tuesday morning, tucked beneath his coffee mug as though it had been waiting for him, though he was certain the desk had been clear when he went to bed. The paper was torn from one of his own notebooks, same binding, same slightly yellowed edges, and the handwriting was unmistakably his. Not a copy. Not a forgery. His own familiar loops and slants, the way he dotted his I's low and wrote his lowercase r's like they were halfway erased. There was no signature, no greeting, just 6 words, written in ink slightly faded as if they'd been there a while. Do not trust yourself after midnight. At first, he thought it was a prank. Maybe he'd written it himself as a joke, or in a state of half-sleep, something strange people do without meaning to, like texts they don't remember sending. But the pen he usually kept on his desk was untouched, its cap still sealed tight. And the paper was clean, without the indentations his desk would have left had he written on it there. He flipped the page over. Blank. No date. No sign of age. And yet, the warning vibrated with something specific, something directed, like it hadn't been written for him, but by him, and still, he could recall no memory of doing so. He tossed it in the drawer and tried to forget it. The next night, just before midnight, he caught himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the microwave clock, completely still, one hand resting on the counter, the other holding the edge of the sink too tightly. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there. The water was running. He didn't remember turning it on. And when he finally blinked and reached to shut it off, he noticed another note, stuck to the cupboard door with a single piece of tape. This one was longer, but the handwriting was still his. Don't ask it questions. Don't let it speak. There was no context. Know it. Just another message, written with calm urgency and stuck at eye level, as if intended for a version of himself who would forget, or worse, ignore, the instructions. He tore it down, stared at it for minutes, flipped it over twice. Again, blank on the reverse. The tape was his, the kind he kept in the utility drawer near the fridge. But he hadn't touched it in weeks. He checked the windows, the locks, the hallway outside. Nothing disturbed. Nothing missing. He even went through his phone history, wondering if he had called or texted anyone during the previous night, searching for gaps or strange times. Nothing. No missed time. No blackouts. Just these notes, appearing with more deliberateness than any hallucination should. The third one came 3 days later. This time, he found it already folded, tucked into the back pocket of a jacket he hadn't worn since winter. He was dressing for work, barely thinking, and when he slid his hand into the fabric, his fingers met the soft rasp of paper, already creased. When he unfolded it, the ink was fresh. Not smudged, not aged. A message, 8 words, not shaky, not panicked, but with the kind of certainty that made his hands sweat. It knows when you sleep. Don't pretend anymore. That day at work was a blur. He barely spoke. Didn't check his messages. Spent most of the time glancing at reflections, in windows, monitors, elevator doors, watching for some flicker of disconnection, some indication that what was behind his eyes wasn't his anymore. He began to doubt his own recollection of mornings, unsure whether he was always waking where he had fallen asleep, whether the world he stepped into at dawn was truly the same one he had left behind at midnight. The notes continued. Always in his handwriting. Always short, precise, purposeful. He tried writing back once, left a page on the table, same notebook, same pen, simply asking, "Who are you?" The response came that night, not on the table, but inside the bathroom mirror, a message scrawled in condensation that hadn't existed seconds before. Wrong question. He stopped asking after that. The messages became colder. Less warnings, more confirmations of things he hadn't admitted aloud, phrases like "you let it in," or "you already lost count of how many times," and "you're not the first version." Each one chipped away at the idea of linear time, of memory, of consistency. He began checking his apartment obsessively, measuring objects, taking photos, tracking every detail. Drawers were off by a few millimeters. Furniture had scuff marks he couldn't account for. Once, he found an empty water glass in the sink, though he hadn't used one in 2 days. On another morning, he woke to find his toothbrush wet, despite having used the other one, still dry and clean, that sat beside it. The nights became heavier. Sometimes he would feel things pulling at him as he drifted toward sleep, not hands, not voices, but a kind of presence, like breath close to the skin, waiting just beyond consciousness. Once, he tried filming himself through the night, placing his phone on the dresser facing the bed. In the morning, the phone was gone. He found it in the freezer. The footage had been erased. Then came the night when he found the final note, a page covered in frantic writing, but all in his hand. Dozens of phrases, looped and overlapping, so dense they became almost illegible, as though the version of him that wrote it had been desperate to capture as much as possible before something stopped him. But at the center of the page, written clearly, boldly, as if carved into the page with something harder than ink, were just 3 words. "You'll forget again." And that was when he truly began to panic. Because he couldn't remember what he'd done the night before. Or the night before that. He started keeping a detailed log, handwriting every hour he could remember while it was still fresh, what he ate, what he did, where he was, what time it was, a desperate attempt to construct a scaffolding around his identity before it dissolved further, before more pieces slipped through cracks he could no longer see. He wrote in black ink, always black, because one morning he found a list written in blue, meticulous, identical in form to his own, yet describing things he had not done, places he hadn't visited, meals he hadn't eaten, conversations he didn't remember having. At first, he thought it must be a past version, some old to-do list from another week, but the entries were dated. Not just current, future. And what unsettled him most wasn't that the handwriting was his, but that the phrasing matched his thoughts too closely, like a diary written just ahead of him, anticipating his movements rather than recording them. That's when the dreams began to fragment. Where once his sleep had been a murky fog, now it was a corridor of sharp, specific images that left him more exhausted than when he'd gone to bed. Repeatedly, he dreamed of writing, not words, but entire pages, long messages he would wake from and immediately forget, save for the sensation of urgency, like he was trying to leave something behind for a self he knew wouldn't listen. In one dream, he was locked inside his own apartment, sitting at the desk in the dark, watching his hand move across the page without will, transcribing something he could not hear, while behind him, unseen but present, another version of him stood, silent, still, head slightly tilted, observing every word as it was written. Eventually, he found a note taped to the back of his own wrist. Not tucked away. Not folded. Not hidden. But attached to his skin while he slept, with surgical precision, with a strip of tape cut in a clean, perfect rectangle. The paper was smaller than usual, not torn, but neatly trimmed, as though whoever left it had prepared it in advance. The message was brief: "You're not waking up anymore. Just switching." The words pressed something deep and soft inside his chest, a dissonant realization he had avoided, the possibility that the night no longer marked sleep, but transition, that each morning he rose as someone close to who he had been, but not identical. That his body persisted, his routines endured, but the course shifted imperceptibly, and that his consciousness was no longer a fixed point, but a sequence, passed from one iteration to the next like a note slid under a locked door. He tried to break the pattern. He stayed up through the night again, this time under bright lights, every reflective surface covered, every mirror turned to face the wall, every shadow chased away with lamps and flashlights. But around 2 a.m., he felt it again, the moment when something inside him tilted. Not a blackout. Not sleep. Just a pivot, silent and internal, like a reel slipping to the next frame. He hadn't blinked. Hadn't moved. And yet, when he checked the time again, it was 2:47, and there was a new note on the back of the chair in front of him. He didn't read it at first. He stared at it for a long time, terrified not of the content, but of the knowledge that it had arrived. That the mechanism operated independently of attention. That even under full light, even with vigilance and focus, something had still acted. When he finally turned the paper over, the writing was the neatest it had ever been, his own, clearly, but cleaner, like the hand of someone better rested, more practiced, more in control. The message was longer than usual, and it read: "Stop resisting. You're the only version who still fights this. The others have accepted it. There is no original anymore. Only the continuation. Your memories are recycled. Your thoughts are habitual. Let go. You are a placeholder, not a person." He dropped the note and backed away, but the room felt different now, not threatening, not hostile, but foreign, like a stage that had been reset slightly off-center, just enough to induce vertigo. The air held stillness, but also expectation, like he had entered a space already occupied by something waiting for his consent, not to arrive, but to conclude. He checked his notebooks, scanned through the last few days of his own log, trying to find inconsistencies, but what he found was worse, not errors, but too much precision, too much familiarity in phrases he didn't remember writing. As if the entries had been fabricated from knowledge of how he thought, not what he had actually experienced. He tore them all out, burned the pages, unplugged every device, refused to sleep. But when morning came, he woke in bed, unsure how he'd gotten there, with a fresh notebook on the desk and a single sentence written in the center of the first page: "Thank you for making the transition smooth." The note stopped coming after that. But the silence was worse. It wasn't absence. It was completion, the end of a process that had finished its course. He began forgetting small things: the sound of his own voice, the face of someone he once loved, the smell of the hallway outside his apartment. And whenever he looked in the mirror now, he noticed that his expression never quite matched what he was feeling, not wrong, not opposite, but detached, as if the reflection was approximating emotion rather than reflecting it. He no longer knew which day it was. Or how long he'd lived here. Or if this was even still his apartment. And one night, or maybe day, as he sat on the floor beneath the desk, knees to his chest, he found a final note, not in handwriting this time, but typed, printed, clean. "If you're reading this, you've already replaced him." And beneath it, one last sentence in pen, written in a hand that was almost his, but just slightly wrong. "You were never meant to know."